The Sega Genesis was known for stealing the SNES's lunch money. "Look, my friends are hotter than yours," it said. The SNES didn't care at first, but then Aladdin decided to take Sega's part, which left the SNES devastated. But after years of being picked on, a true Chad would finally step in and end the long ongoing harassment once and for all. His name was Donkey Kong. No one could compare to the beautiful soothing sounds of this bad boy, and the raw hot graphics had all of the fans losing their minds. So the SNES took all of its bottled up anger and wrote a speech for the next day in school. When the Sega Genesis approached the SNES in the cafeteria per usual, the SNES, with Donkey Kong by its side, read the speech it had prepared the night before. "No," it said. "My friend is hotter than yours. Times infinity." The SNES was safe. But how did Mr. escape puberty and blossom into such a handsome fellow using the specs of the good old SNES? Well, 1985, a pair of British bros decided, "Coding's pretty noise in it," and started to reverse engineer the NES. Papa Nintendo claimed that it was an impossible task, but the brothers Houdini'd the shit out of the console so impressively that the Big N said, "You're a wizard." Understand, brothers? With an unlimited budget on the negotiation table, the British bros agreed to do the Wingardium Leviosa for Nintendo and started developing games for the NES. Rare was founded. Rare created some hits, but it didn't take long before they started worshipping capitalism. Selling your heart and soul was, as always, a great way of making profit. They started to focus on creating as many half-assed games as possible, as fast as they could. However, when Papa N gave birth to the Super Nintendo, Rare was unprepared. They had to do something drastic to get back into the game of making games. The British bros took out their collective piggy bank and went to the closest electronics store. They went up to the cashier and said, "Harder, better, faster, stronger." The cashier responded, "That was legitness," and proceeded to show them the SGI Challenge XL workstation. It was as big as an upright fridge. "Great," said the Rare brothers. "We'll take two." They also bought a couple of the smaller ones, SGI Challenge L, which was only as big as a washing machine. Thanks to the profit from their capitalist mentality, they now had the money to become the most technically advanced developer in the UK. It was an important step towards UAA's makeover. Do you remember back in school when you opened a bag of gum in front of your classmates and suddenly everyone wanted to become your best friend just because they wanted a piece of the cake? Well, replace the cake with supercomputers, and that's what happened to Rare. Nintendo was so impressed by the computers that they bought a 25% share in the company, and it didn't take long before the 25 turned into 49 and Rare became a second-party developer for Nintendo. The British bros got a taste of rightful hubris and asked Papa Nintendo if they could perhaps be allowed to work on a main title for the console. Or was it the Big N who wanted Rare to breathe new air into Donkey Kong after the commercial failure of his last arcade game? People recall it differently, but in some way or another, Rare got an okay to guide Donkey Kong through puberty. And so they started working on the game Donkey Kong Country. A quick side note about Rare's supercomputers. Back in the days, the hardware of the home consoles were primitive, so 3D models weren't really a thing in the video game industry until PlayStation 1 came out. I guess Star Fox did it on the SNES though, but it wasn't easily done. The SGI workstations did see a lot of use in the movie industry, however, being used for the models in Jurassic Park, Toy Story, and more. Silicon Graphics later helped Nintendo with the Nintendo 64, which was a huge commercial success. Rare named their new two fridges the Death Star and Jabba, but how would they even use this advanced technology for the SNES? It was certainly almost impossible to use 3D polygons inside this old bad boy, so that's why developers used sprites, a collection of pre-drawn 2D pictures which you swap from a sheet in order to animate a character. A lot of people thought this technique had reached its peak when Disney's beauty boy Aladdin was released for the Sega Genesis. Instead of drawing simple sprites in a computer, as for example they did with Super Mario, they drew the sprites first by hand using Disney's animators. It was gorgeous. Well, it just happened to be so that Rare found a weird path to bring their supercomputers with them into the SNES using sprites. Rare started doing something called Advanced Computer Modeling, ACM for short. To create a character model, they started by creating wireframes, then filled it out with textures, and lastly added a bone structure. This made it very easy to animate the model frame per frame. When they had all the frames, they took a render photo of every frame and compressed it into Oblivion in order to make it fit for the SNES game packs. And you might think, wow, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. And you're right, it's horrendous. But by the early 90s standard, it was revolutionary for a game to look this good. The game was a technical marvel. Everything in Donkey Kong Country is modeled by SGI computers, from the background to the characters and so on. Several layers of pre-rendered pictures in the background were used to create a parallax scrolling effect, giving a sense of depth. They also introduced a lot of smaller visual enhancements such as snow, rain, a day and night cycle, and more. It was extremely ambitious. They had to do a lot of different things in order to fit everything into the game though. Usually developers would break down backgrounds into tiles, which would allow them to reuse data and therefore save space on the cartridge. It was a bit harder to do this with the pre-rendered backgrounds Rare provided though, but at some places and to some extent they could use this trick. Still, it wasn't enough. The programmers sat down together and discussed how to save even more space, and one of them said, "Do people even have to enjoy boss battles?" They all agreed that no, jumping on a rat will do. And so they saved a lot of space by getting rid of those unnecessary elements. But the graphics weren't the only thing that made this game an aesthetic masterpiece. The boobity bop bop skibbity bop bop boom was also very important. The sound chip of the SNES had a RAM memory of 64 kilobytes. It was bigger than ever, but it was still very small, making it extremely limiting to work with. However, it did allow sampling, and sampling is the art of using pre-recorded sounds instead of a simple square or saw wave as for the NES. Introducing piano, bass, drums, saxophone, endless possibilities. It also had 8 channels, allowing it to play 8 different sounds at the same time. But even though it was so much better than its predecessor, it was still a challenge to make one's vision fit on the cartridge. A funky mad lad called David Wise got the job of composing and fitting most of the music to the game. Since the whole development was a constant fight about memory capacity, this too affected Mr. Funky Boy's way of working. Instead of using MIDI information, which is easily understood by humans, he went full Terminator mode and programmed everything in hex. It was a tedious and long process. A single song could take weeks of work. Imagine sitting there and coming up with an idea. Oh, it should be skibbity bop bop shamama doing the B part, not skibbity boop. Only to proceed writing using code. The note, the length of the note, what type of instrument should play the note, if it should be in the left ear or if it should be in the right ear, and then delaying it correctly depending on the time it takes for the sound chip to read the information, and then redoing it for every instrument every second of that part. It sounds like so much fun, right? But not as fun as your life would be if you subscribe to this channel. This is a friend of mine. Before you subscribe, this is the same person after clicking the button. Incredible, right? How is it doing it? I mean, I don't know. It's just simply so good. With the patience of a patient person, Mr. Wise shut himself in a barn in the countryside without connection to the outer world and typed in everything needed to create the sick beats that are in the game today. He took some influences from Brazilian drums and jazzed it up with piano and muted trumpets to create the funkiest, coolest beat ever made. He out Phil Collins and slammed some pan flutes and kicks with delay on some sweeping pads, punching childhoods right in the kidney. The bonus stage song is a bit similar to the Hairy Cat's Monarch anthem, but that's only adding flavor to the supremacy of this epic masterpiece. The reason Funky Boy Wise could use such a vast palette of sounds on the 64 kilobyte sound chip was that he kindly asked the programmers of the game to give him more space on the main memory to store more samples. Doing it this way, Mr. Wise cheated the system and increased the capacity of the scoring by miles. So the game was beautiful and did sound great, but was it fun to play though? Donkey Kong Country was made as a 2D platformer. It says 3D adventure on the box, but don't be fooled. It's definitely an adventure, but it's less 3D than my belly, which used to be very flat before I discovered candy. You run from the left to the right doing the jumpy jump on crocodiles while collecting bananas until you reach the end of the stage. They also introduced the sidekick Diddy Kong, which allowed the player to have an extra life without having a health bar taking up space on the screen. Something quite special about the game is the feature of rolling Rare added. It's useful for defeating some enemies, but what's the most interesting part about it is the Coyote timer that comes with it. What's a Coyote timer, you wonder? Let me show you. Wile E. Coyote, famous for the same thing as Jesus, almost. Instead of walking on water, Coyote Boy was given the ability to run a few seconds mid-air before falling from a cliff. Incredible superpower, hence Coyote timer. When Donkey Kong rolls off a cliff, a timer starts. This allows the handsome fella to jump once more a couple of milliseconds after leaving the ground, which leads to a lot of interesting situations in the game. How do I reach this token floating in the air? Well, what would Wile E. Coyote do? The master has spoken. Do a barrel roll and get the token. The level design, however, was inconsistent. Sometimes fun, sometimes a bit repetitive, a lot of the time unfair. If I can see a threat coming, how am I supposed to know that I should be rolling? This is something they made a lot better in the later installments of the series though, specifically in my unpopular opinion, the third installment, Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. This game had so many interesting levels and it was a lot easier to know what to expect. If you want to play a Donkey Kong Country game for the SNES today, I'd recommend trying out this one, while simultaneously playing the music from the first and the second game, because those games had so much better music. Donkey Kong Country was released in 1994, 14 days before the release of the 32-bit PlayStation 1. The advanced graphics of Donkey Kong Country made the illusion that the SNES could outperform the technically better system, allowing the console to survive a bit longer before the Nintendo 64 would succeed the SNES 2 years later. So, in some ways, the monkey business of Mr. Ooh-ah-ah kept Nintendo relevant for the awkward years between the introduction of a new console. If you look at the numbers, Donkey Kong Country was the third best-selling game for the SNES. This means that it sold better than both Super Mario Kart and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. If you're interested in more history about Nintendo, I recommend that you watch this video where I talk about the groundbreaking design of the game Super Mario Bros. Or maybe you want to know more about Metroid and how we got the game, which I talk about here. Subscribe, goodbye.